Who was she? Can you tell us who
Barbara Honegger worked for the Bush-Reagan campaign in 1980 and then quit in a volatile protest of their activities, and has made a crusade out of exposing the October surprise.
We might as well get into this, since this is one of the stories that was covered over by the mainstream media. What was her initial story?
Well, her initial story was that the Reagan-Bush campaign, William Casey, the Reagan-Bush campaign had made a deal with the Iranians to keep the embassy hostage through the elections, and then another 76 days so that Carter wouldn't even get credit for their release, you know, so that Reagan would get the full credit for their release. And they were, in fact, released 2 hours after he was sworn in, which was enough time for the word to get back to Iran that he was, in fact, president. And then, you know, they were the hostages were released. They were actually held at the airport waiting for this confirmation. And then to go back to our other thing we were working on here is, why didn't Dukakis take Bush's head off with this stuff, which he could have. God knows, you can see the television commercials or shows, you know, or interview 5-minute segments showing the Noriega link, the Black Eagle, the whole stuff. We had all of this, and we were definitely trying to feed it to them. And what we got back from them was
this is from the Dukakis
from
campaign.
the Dukakis, and we got inside. We got we got the movie Cover Up delivered to them. We got the movie, the PBS Frontline show Guns, Drugs, and the CIA delivered to them. We got in to see them, some of the people in this broad, disorganized group of scholars researching this thing, and we got from them a resistance. They essentially, and feedback, as one of the senior Dukakis people told Jim Driscoll, who's in our community with the America's Peace Test in Nevada, that John Stockwell's facts are all screwed up. And you know, I immediately, what facts? What is it? Because I consider myself, if not an academic, nevertheless a scholar of these things. And so, what facts? Because I want to check them out. Because if I am screwed up, I don't. You know, I don't. And they wouldn't give us any details, but they just rejected the stuff out of hand. Now, if you permit me, just very quickly to create a scenario or give you my analysis of what happened. And we note the scandal broke, or was broken, by the establishment in November of '86, the Iran-Contra scandal, and it led to a dismantling of the Reagan White House. And then later they gave him his credibility back with the INF agreement. Now, in the winter of 1987, George Bush was written up by every major columnist as being out of business. He was finished politically. They were saying this openly. George Will was writing columns that the Republican Party was out. The Democrats were clearly going to win the next time around, and they were all writing that George Bush could not survive the Iran-Contra scandal. And this is because they, including the conservative columnists and the establishment press, had this material back then. And they knew about George Bush's involvement in all of this stuff. And the scandal was breaking, and they did not believe that he could survive. By the spring, he had survived to the point, battling, as I put it, to stay out of jail. He had hung in there. He didn't resign or retire. And they began to wonder what the U.S. People's tolerance was of this scandal, how much it would stick. Then they engineered the Iran-Contra hearings in the summer, which were carefully orchestrated by Danny Inouye, the Democrat, in cooperation with the other Democrats. Cohen and Mitchell, for example, wrote the book Men of Zeal, which they profess to be an expose of behind the scenes, but they do not, in fact, expose. It's a continuation of the cover-up. They do not, for example, discuss their resistance at having of allowing the Black Eagle stuff to be investigated, and their own resistance of having the George Bush drug linkage investigated. So the committee drew a line and said, we won't investigate beyond this line. So they gave the nation the appearance of an airing, and they did not, in fact, probe into the things that would have led them into the impeachment of George Bush. And this had a catharsis effect on the nation. And then we get into the fall, and then the winter of '88, and then the spring, and there's still a debate going on in public. Remember Dan Rather, who tried to nail Bush.
Right.
He tried to break this stuff
On
into
that
the
special
open.
CBS interview.
And what happened was the establishment came down on him and said, no, we're not going to go after George Bush. Until eventually, in the summer of '88, when we were once again trying to break this, Bush eventually was able to laugh at the cameras at the Republican convention, because we had journalists, we had found journalists who would ask the questions, who went up on national television and said, what about the Iran-Contra thing? And he just laughed at them and said, I'm not even going to answer those questions anymore. The nation doesn't care about the Iran-Contra scandal. That is history. I've answered those questions. Forget it. Don't ask me anymore. Now, in the meantime, this establishment, this party that we have, the single-party state, this fraternity that runs this country, that has two chapters, a Republican and a Democrat, one a little bit more liberal than the other one more conservative, representing the big business interests more directly. That's the Republicans. In terms of their interests, that's the A team. But they always have the B team that they can run out. A Jimmy Carter, when Richard Nixon makes the nation too angry, or the nation gets too riled at the Vietnam War, or something like that. This is where they produced Michael Dukakis. He's a team player to the establishment. In order to be accepted as a presidential candidate, he did homage to the arms race. He said eventually that he would give humanitarian aid to the Contras. He would consider it. He said definitely he would give military aid to El Salvador, which means he bought into all the principles of the covert secret government, of the covert operations, of the covert manipulation of the world.
He was singing another song when he was trying to get the Democratic nomination.
That's right. Before, his background was progressive, but he bought in. They screened him into the system. They groomed him into the system. He was advised that he could run, but if he would. So what he was there is if the nation had clung, had its outrage had been sufficient over the Iran-Contra scandal, they had Dukakis standing by, the B team to their interests, and he would give them some grief by spending some money on housing and on medical insurance for people and things like that, which is not their choice of the way to invest the money. They want to invest it in missiles and things where they make greater profits. But he would support the arms race, and he would support the CIA and the covert establishment, the national security state's activities. But then they realized they did not have to go with the B team. The people didn't care. They didn't have to give the nation a B team. So they went ahead and went with the A team, which was George Bush, i.e. they concluded eventually that they could Teflonize Bush despite all of this incredible activity and sell him to the nation, and they did.
Why, though, did Dukakis, as the B team, not go after Bush more aggressively?
Because he's a member of the team. He's a member of the fraternity. Why did Dan Inouye? They had Ronald Reagan and George Bush by the short hairs. They could have impeached them, and they didn't, because they couldn't impeach a popular president like Reagan and Bush without losing control, the public trust. See, this gets back into the Howard Zinn thesis that the American Revolution occurred when the rich white males over here wanted to take power away from the same element in England, and they engineered a deal with the people whereby they would give more freedom to the people than they had under the monarchy or the colony. But nevertheless, the rich white males would retain control. And this dynamic relationship, we don't have a democracy. We do not, even to this day, vote for the president. We vote for electors who select the president. In addition to which, this two-party system we've evolved gives them further control, because even the selection of the candidates, it's done by about 50% vote, popular vote through the primaries, and about 50% through the frozen delegates, or the hard delegates, or the super delegates, who are party hacks, who control, the party machinery, controlling ultimately who gets nominated. This is why Pat Schroeder gave it a run and dropped out, is because her traveling and consulting with the super delegates, the frozen delegates, the power structure of the party, she was told she would not be permitted to win whatever happened, on the popular side of things. And then once that was decided, the money was not available to her. Now this system, as it has continued for 200 years, is a tenuous relationship in which the people who own the country, the people on the the Federal Reserve Board, the people who manage the money and the moneyed interest, the strength of the capitalist system, these people know that they're riding a potentially rebellious horse in the American people whose interests are not being fully served. Myth has to be maintained to make this thing run. And it's a constant balance of what do they have to give the people to keep them on board the system, and at what point are they going to lose the system. You read the history through Zen's eyes of the United States, or the Graham book on the history of violence in the United States, and you see that every time the people have become angry enough, the system has yielded to them. The labor struggles at the turn of the century, for example, the Vietnam War and Civil Rights days, when blacks rose up in the country with a massive boycott and it began to really hurt the economic interests.
You start burning down the small businesses in the ghettos, the white businesses
White
in the
business
ghettos.
and Detroit and Watts and 14th Street in Washington. And you know, when the system was breaking apart, the establishment yielded every time. And the system self-destructed. The cynicism of the Reagan years, in which one of the more dramatic transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich occurred, was orchestrated by Ronald Reagan through the arms race, the $2 trillion on arms, the mechanisms that he set up for him, the rigging of the taxes, where he could say taxes had been cut when they had been redistributed to hurt the middle class and poor more. This thing came to a head under the Iran-Contra scandal. And once again, the establishment was faced in the winter of '87. They were saying, we've had it, the people have had it, and we're going to have to give them the Democrats for a while. And they came up eventually with what was to them the perfect candidate was Dukakis, who had a reputation of being clean after the corruption of the Reagan years, who had a reputation of being somewhat of a populist, as Jimmy Carter did, who could be sold as a cleansing, sort of as a, here, we sympathize, here, you can have your president for a while. The truth is that Jimmy Carter had foisted upon him Zbig Brzezinski, who was an utter fascist in his policies to control the national security decisions. So Carter's human rights stuff couldn't go too far, and he wound up setting in motion the arms buildup that eventually evolved into the Reagan arms buildup, which is the biggest peacetime buildup in the history of, the biggest buildup in the arms buildup in the history of the world.
And Brzezinski moved into the Bush camp during this campaign.
Indeed, and of course that's part of the October, the election held hostage. The Playboy article brings that out very clearly, is that having put, he doesn't get into there, having put Carter in office to placate the people after Nixon, after Vietnam, after the civil rights struggle, that Zen gets into that, but they're taking it up at the end of the Carter era, where two things had happened. One is the Federal Reserve Board cooked the economy. And so we had runaway inflation, which would scare people. You could feel it, you could taste it, and the newspapers talked about it every day and blamed it on Carter. And when he doesn't control this stuff, the Federal Reserve Board does. And then the other thing was the national security establishment went after him with a passion. The CIA operatives cooperating with Bush Reagan during the presidential campaign of 1980, the Pentagon cooperating, McFarlane, their Marine officer working in the State Department advising, but having committed himself to the Bush side. All of these tendrils go back to the security establishment saying, okay, we've given them Carter for 4 years, now let's get back to work. And they got Reagan in there. To summarize, they got Reagan in there, and he eventually self-destructed, or the system self-destructed under his watch. They thought they were going to have to give us Dukakis to placate the people, and then they found that the people simply don't care enough. The people simply aren't vigilant enough of their own interests to care enough about this monumental corruption from George Bush and the people around him, and they were able to continue with the A-team in office with George Bush to extend and continue the policies of Ronald Reagan, to exploit the nation, and to keep in lockstep with the drug runners, not to mention the military machinery.
I think that's an excellent analysis of how the establishment would view the two different candidates and why they would then decide that they could pull behind Bush and go with what you call the A team again. It still doesn't completely explain why the B team, that is Dukakis and the Democrats, didn't fight harder for the presidency, didn't go after Bush more aggressively on this Noriega drugs, Contra drugs, the Iran arms deals, the whole relationships of Bush and Reagan to the Ayatollahs. Why didn't Dukakis and the Democrats use these issues to probably win the election if they could have publicized them? It was the negative campaign of Bush against Dukakis that many people think helped win it for Bush. Couldn't Dukakis have done an honest negative campaign against Bush, telling the actual truth about Bush? And why didn't he? I still have trouble.
Of course.
The fact that the Reagan administration is the most corrupt in the history of the country. They've had, what, almost 200 people either indicted or in jail for corruption in this administration.
And the Democrats didn't go after this corruption issue. Why?
Well, this again gets back to the decision they made. I mean, we can only cite what they did, and then it speaks for itself. Dan Inouye, running this committee, a Democrat, made it a joint thing, and then the Democrats shut up and let the Republicans use it as a forum to advance the national security state, the CIA's activities, the Contra program, instead of exposing the corruption. That's where the decision was made. Dukakis is just another member of the team. Whatever economic miracle supposedly occurred in Massachusetts under his governorship was done in great part with defense expenditures. He is bought into the system. He's a member of the team. With the establishment, as we know, as we've observed, I remember talking to Les Kurtz about this when he was developing the draft of his book, The Nuclear Cage, and we were talking about the military-industrial, the Iron Triangle, the military-industrial complex, the defense corporations, the Pentagon, and the Congress. And then we took it a step further. Of course, it includes the media. As everyone well knows, the point of alternative views is that the media is owned, literally, by the same people who own the defense corporations. But then we took it a step further. It's not even a quadrangle. It's a pentad, or a pentagon, because you also have the universities, the educational system, in which the defense corporations and the Pentagon are careful to invest heavily. 70% of some of these big universities' budgets come from defense, money. So the professors are paid for, the salaries are paid for by the defense complex, and so they're bought into the system. So you have that power structure and control, and that power structure determined not to let the system be destroyed or be weakened, even at the price of their own. Let me put it this way. Jimmy Carter, for example, he demonstrated this what I would call misdirected loyalty. After the 1980 thing, he did not go public and protest the Iran-Contra deal. He did not protest it in October when he had these reports coming in, because he didn't want to destroy the system of which he was part. To go back to another era, in 1960, Richard Nixon lost to John Kennedy in a very close election, which turned in part on Mayor Daley in Chicago, counting every grave in Chicago twice. Now, this scandal was known at the time. Nixon didn't mention it until, God knows, 20 years later. He eventually said he couldn't make an issue without destroying the credibility of the presidential election process, and he wanted to have another shot at the presidency.
Which he got.
Which he got and became president. If he had destroyed or attacked the system, if he had exposed that scandal, it would have destroyed, perhaps, it wouldn't take all that much to lead the American people to have a big mental breakthrough and demand a change in the system, perhaps in the direction of a parliamentary system where we could, at the time of an Iran-Contra scandal, there would be forced a vote of confidence, and Reagan certainly would have been out. In December of 86, he would have been out, without question.
This is my studies on the power structure in the mass media. This is the main thing they try to keep from the American public, how the economic and political system really works, because the Americans wouldn't like that at all if they really knew.
Saw how scared the establishment dodged a bullet, how scared they got in the Jackson run at the presidency this last time, because Jackson is the first national prominent figure since I can remember who has achieved prominence and represents the interests of the people pretty directly. And the manipulations they had to go through to keep him from getting a position of in fact, power. Just to cite one example of how far they will go, this loose association of X's from the national security, we were flying to Iowa to do a hearing to try to force the candidates to tell us their policies. At that point, there were a lot of candidates. And on the plane, the day we went up there, the New York Times had a big piece on where the polls put all the candidates at that time in Iowa. And it had Simon, I think, was leading in a big front page article, and then a long discussion, Simon and Dukakis and the others and whatnot. And then you went to page 3 for the bigger article, the details, and it turns out Jesse Jackson was running a very close second. It was sort of like 33 to 31, but his name was not mentioned on the front page of the New York Times.
Well, the Times...
And inside they showed the polls, but on the front page they didn't want him to have the name recognition.
Well, the Times and all the mainstream media pretty much did a blackout on the, excuse the metaphor, on the Jackson campaign until the Super Tuesday primaries where he won, and then he became ahead, actually, after the Michigan primaries. He was the front runner, and then they had to give some attention to Jackson, and they tried to make it negative, and then Dukakis regained the momentum in the Pennsylvania, New York primaries. So that was probably the only hope, looking back.
The party machinery shifted gears at that time, scared, because Jackson was leading, and there was a chance that the people would really get excited about this thing, and that 50% control asserted itself. The party machinery asserted itself. And Jackson was pushed down, and Dukakis was run in instead. They did it by calling Jackson a radical. They said it's not racial, we have no problem with his skin color, although there would be some people in the South who wouldn't vote for him, but he's a radical, meaning he doesn't support the establishment. And they got that word out to the party, to the party hacks throughout the nation. And the result is that Jackson's, I've been wishing and hoping, like what you said, that Jackson would split off and give us a third party. And with the people that I believe would follow him, we might be able to force onto the two-party system a viable third party. And then we could, throw our block of votes to the right or the left, depending on who would give us the most real concessions. I don't think Jackson will ever get these concessions from the Democratic Party, which is where he's trying to.
I noticed the election night, I flipped on one channel, I think it was NBC, and the analyst was saying, well, the reason Dukakis lost was because Jackson spoke out for him. And then I immediately turned to the next channel, which was ABC, and that pundit was saying, well, the reason he lost was because Jackson refused to support him.
Which was total nonsense, because Jackson was traveling all over the country, literally every day, campaigning, 10 things a day he was doing, or, many.
And then this was followed up, I saw a big Newsweek article analyzing the election, and it said, well, they were looking at the prospects for the future, and they said the only thing the Democrats can do is to go with people like Gary Robb, who are conservatives, so that the Democrats can move to the right. They said the worst thing they could do would be go Jesse Jackson, because it would tear apart the Democratic Party and destroy it.
Who have lost every election with these centrist liberals like Mondale and Dukakis.
But you were talking about the Democrats. Isn't there another problem which the Democrats had, and that is they went lockstep right along with Reagan and Reaganomics and providing money for the Contras. The whole bit. Arms buildup.
Absolutely. See, the arms buildup, for example, the money, the power structure that keeps the Democrats in office, the ones that are in office, Reaganomics paid off enormously for them. Now, you do get into a lot of individual struggles and infighting, and the system, it isn't monolithic, it isn't the controllers of the country being in lockstep. Not at all. Some of them actually jump out of the windows of their office buildings in New York committing suicide on occasion. There's a lot of tugging and pulling, but nevertheless, when the chips are down, the establishment will not go for the jugular vein, their own jugular vein, if you will. They will cooperate in a cover-up. Howard Baker, going in to straighten out the Reagan White House, thereby perhaps forever abandoning his shot at the presidency. Nixon, refusing to expose the scandal. Jimmy Carter refusing to expose the scandal.
And Dukakis is the same thing.
Dukakis refusing to expose the scandal. Lyndon Johnson's behavior after they'd killed John Kennedy. The Warren Commission, a cover-up, let's get back to business as usual, let's calm the nation down. Let's not take the scab off the wound, and let the people see. Let's paper it over and cover it up and put a bandage on it and get on with business as usual.
Well,
because of what's at stake is the viability of the system for them.
So to draw a conclusion, to wrap up our discussion today, it would seem that we really can't expect from the Democrats or the media any real exposures of the scandals and corruption of the system, any real important efforts to change or reform or transform the system. It really depends on the people, that we're the only active agents of change, that it depends on alternative media, alternative socially critical progressive researchers to dig this dirt up. That this is sort of our obligation, that if change is going to happen, it's not going to come from the Democratic Party, it's not going to come from the media, it can only come from the people, so that our obligation during the Bush years is to be critical, vigilant, and militant in trying to smoke out all of these scandals and get rid of Bush and force the system to change. So that's the only way change comes about.
That's the end of this Alternative Views. Glad we could share it with you. For more information on the American power structure, read The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn,